Good morning and welcome back. It is now July 28th. It is a beautiful sunny morning out here, but as you can see behind me, there is still some thunderstorm clouds forming off to the west. We did have some pretty wild thunderstorms move through the area last night. Cardston, it sounds like, got hit pretty hard with some golf ball to tennis ball sized hail, so expect significant damage in that area. But here, all we got was more rain. So we are definitely starting to recharge some of those soil moisture reserves, and things are looking not too bad. So let's take a look and see what's going on this week. Dryland barley is certainly starting to ripen up pretty quick, moving into hard dough stage, but there's still quite a few green heads here and there. Worrying thing that we are seeing in some fields is new green tillers are starting to appear, so we'll have to keep an eye out for those. Of course, it is certainly not worth waiting for these to mature. Dryland wheat plots this week are looking pretty good. You might notice we have two different types of heads in here, some of which are taller than others. So it looks like we may have had some contamination in our seed source here. We have one type of wheat that it tends to be a little bit taller and has fewer awns on it. So I'm not sure exactly what it is that happened there, but yeah, we'll see how it all turns out in the end, I suppose. Well, corn growth has been pretty steady in the last week or so. Even with the cooler temperatures, we've had enough light and heat units for the corn to continue growing and developing. So we do actually even have the odd tassel starting to come out, like there's one here behind me now. So we are basically just starting to come into tasseling time. So that's basically our highest water usage time, as well as we need a good amount of nitrogen at this stage. So if your nitrogen levels aren't topped up, now is an excellent time to go in and do some fertigation. Well, last night's round of thunderstorms managed to drop another 3/4 to 1 inch of rain across my area, so this poor tractor and seed drill has been sitting here for a few days now, trying to seed some oats and brassica as a cover crop in where we took off this barley silage, so we have some fall grazing, and field conditions are just too wet. So hopefully we do get a stretch of drier weather so we can get a few things done here this week. Well, there is some signs of wheat head armyworm I'm finding today in some wheat fields. So you can see right here what we have is kind of a desiccated, crappy looking armyworm there with a whole bunch of eggs around it. Now, those eggs are not armyworm eggs. That is a parasitic wasp that feeds on armyworms. So these particular armyworms can be quite difficult to scout for because they tend to drop to the ground and hide during the day. They come out and feed at night. So if you're seeing these egg masses here, they are typically laid on armyworms. So if you're seeing these masses in the awns of your wheat or your barley or whatever, that is an indication you may have wheat head armyworm. Now, typically these do appear, normally, and it's very seldom to ever have a problem with it. So I am only just finding a few heads like this here and there, certainly not any problem fields, but something to be aware of anyways. It appears I may have found my first case of ergot this year, this wheat head in an area so this is like basically a truck path out to a pivot. It hasn't been traveled much lately, but it was enough so that there is a little bit of mechanical damage in there. And that seems to have caused a few heads in here to develop smut that you can see down in here. And this one here looks to have developed a kernel of ergot at the top. So interesting to see. Have not seen much sign of ergot yet, even in fall rye. Well, a lot of the earliest seeded barley fields like this one are some of the worst looking ones now. Because they were at critical developmental stages when we were in full on drought, they really suffered the most, and for the most part aborted tillers, and now we only just have the main heads. And those main heads are filled out pretty well, but now we've just got a huge amount of tillers like these coming up from the bottom. Barley and wheat can both do this when they're affected by drought earlier in the season, and now we are going to pay for that at harvest time. And a lot of these fields we're going to either have to wait or we're going to have to swath because we're going to have a lot of green heads mixed in. Here I'm back at the field where winter wheat got accidentally loaded into the seed drill this spring. Now you can see it's not 100% winter wheat. There is some spring wheat because of course the seed drill was not completely empty at the time. But you can see that it is by far and away mostly winter wheat. And you can see that winter wheat is actually doing quite well, although really it is never going to produce a head. Some of it does look like is hitting stem extension time. So, I mean, there might be the odd head here and there, but most of it is still all just pretty well tillered out. Should provide some pretty good fall grazing, if nothing else. This really does seem to be one of those rare years where we have just as much disease showing up on dryland as we do on irrigation. In my case, it's almost flipped completely over. So most of my irrigated wheat, I had recommended products like, Miravis Ace or something along those lines at head timing, and that'll protect from foliar diseases for a few weeks afterwards. Remember, most fungicides are protective, not curative. On the dryland, however, at the time of heading, the crop was in full stress and wasn't looking all that great, and very, very few people opted to spray any sort of fungicide on dryland. So now what we're seeing is a consequence of that: piles and piles of septoria moving through crops, as well as bits of rust and tan spot and all that fun stuff. So of course, trying to spray this now, probably not economically worthwhile. As I said, fungicide is protective. To prevent this disease, should have been sprayed a few weeks ago, but of course we didn't know that we were going to get all this rain at that time. Here's a common weed I get questions about every year. So this is absinthe wormwood. So this is actually an introduced species, but it's now endemic or naturalized across the prairies here. And quite commonly, I find it along the edges of fields or in areas like this, which is basically along a pasture anyways. You can identify it from a lot of the other plants that look like what we'd call a native sagebrush or whatever, by these unique ball style flowers. So when these develop, that's always a dead giveaway as to exactly what it is. It also has a very intense flavor if you squeeze these. But yeah, anyways, I'm going to be picking and drying some of this for my Amaro project later on this season. Here's another weed we commonly see this time of the year. This is curly cup gumweed. So you can see it has these kind of really curly Velcro-like bristles on the bottom. However, it's not the shape of the bristles that matter. You can see how sticky and gooey these are. They literally just glue themselves to your pants. So basically they flower, set a seed head, and then they stick to clothing or to animals and then spread that way. Typically they don't get very tall. They're not a weed of fields, typically, usually just along the edges of the field, along gravel roads, stuff like that. Not a serious concern, but usually something I hear about every year. This field of barley was seeded a couple weeks behind the area average, and it is certainly paying off this year. Now, 9 times out of 10, it always pays off to seed early, but in the case of this dryland field, it is really paying off. So these heads are going to have an excellent opportunity to fill with all of this new moisture. Now that we've gotten, 5 inches in just over the last week, the potential for a field like this is pretty high compared to some of the earlier seeded barley. Well, here in this crop of tame oats, things are looking not too bad. You can see we have quite a lot of weed pressure in here. Lots of pigweed, mallow, lamb's quarters, that kind of thing going on here, as well as some sow thistles. But so far, we've been trying to get in here for the last week, but field conditions are just so wet, we haven't really been able to. So we're going to try to here in the next day or two. Hopefully things will dry out enough to let us get in. Now, I'm not seeing any signs of barley yellow dwarf virus in here at all yet this year. However, oats, I am seeing a bit of septoria kind of pressure. So we are seeing a little bit of that, but just for comparison, this time last year, we were already seeing some signs of barley yellow dwarf virus. So it is a good sign that we're not really seeing it in the crop very much so far this year. Well, out of the hundreds of giant sunflower seeds I distributed amongst my customers' pivot points this spring, these seem to be the only ones that actually really took off. The customers sprayed everything else out, and sunflowers managed to grow through, so they didn't get overwhelmed by weeds like they did at a lot of other pivot points. Looks like one of them has blown over here, but otherwise looking good. Probably going to see flowers in a couple weeks here. It looks like they are starting to form a bud up here. This field of peas, we're starting to see a little bit of maturity. You can see we got a little bit of color change going on out there, a little bit of lime green, but there's still a whole lot of grass green in this field. We don't really have any flowers left in here, but we do still have some relatively young pods in a lot of these green areas. So this field is still probably a minimum of 10 days away from desiccation timing. Here along the roadside edge of this green canola field, there is some grasshoppers in here that are causing some damage. So you can see we got a couple pods like this that have been chewed open. So that nice tender green pod is prime feeding for a grasshopper. It's full of nutrition and moisture, everything that they want. They don't want that wheat across the road that's starting to dry down. They'd much rather have this nice green lush canola. So we might have to spray this headland here. There's quite a few grasshoppers in here doing this. Really hard to walk through canola apparently when you're about 5 feet tall. This potted canola, actually, he lost his shoes in there trying to get through it. Some fields of fall rye like this one are pretty much at swath timing. We are into hard dough. These grains are pretty much ripe. We're just drying down, so things are looking pretty good here. Now, we're not going to bother swathing right now because the weekend forecast is for the most part, rain. So we're going to wait until next week. We're going to see what the forecast looks like before we bother swathing any of this. We don't want it laying on the ground for days getting rained on. Well, here in this wheat field, we have some field heroes in action. Right here on this head, this guy here is a juvenile ladybug. So that is the larval stage of a ladybug. This one is pretty fat and plump. He's definitely been going to town on the aphids here on this grain head. So this is exactly why we don't want to spray for aphids, is because it's all too easy to get rid of all these guys in a field, and they are absolutely voracious predators of aphids. See if he gets one of those aphids on that head there. Yeah, looks like he's more distracted, I think, trying to flee away from me. All right, that'll be it for this week. The forecast looks like we're supposed to be getting a few days of, at least a 30 to 40% chance of rain. So we'll see what the weekend brings us. So enjoy your long weekend, and we'll see you next week.